So as Sarah mentioned, she and I run a crowdsourcing platform called FromThePage. We focus specifically on textual records, so archival documents, the kinds of things you'd find in special collections. Though this metadata feature may bring us a little further afield. It's kind of interesting to see. Oh, great. You can staff the waiting room. That would be perfect. So we try to keep the software as simple as possible. Traditionally, we present an image to a user and a place for them to type. So historically, we have really focused. We really started building this to work with these kinds of documents, right? And this kind of task. So this is it's not a diary, and I believe it's an early modern recipe book. But the transcription is being done as full text. So this is the kind of thing that you could print and stick in a bound traditional edition. It's the kind of thing that you could ingest into a library finding aid or a catalog system for full text search. So it's not really structured. So this is what the system was originally designed to support. And until about 2018. In 2018, Meredith, hi Meredith, and the folks at the Alabama Department of Archives and History came to us with their colleagues at the Council of State Archivists to fund a structured data transcription. So this is what we call field-based transcription. We have an image that's being presented to the user, and then we have structured fields that include some controlled vocabulary like the county and some specific data types for users to type in. And this is the kind of thing that is not going to be printed. It might be full text searchable, but kind of the highest use of it is to pull it out for re-indexing. It provides an index into, in this case, some vital records from the Marion. In 2021, the Council of State Archives moved further and funded the development of a new type of transcription interface, which is also structured, but it is a different kind of relationship. This is a ledger style or spreadsheet transcription. So in this case, we have structured data, but there are multiple records per image, whereas in the previous case, we had one record for one image. So I keep mentioning different partners, and that's because these are the people who really inform our work. So we work with state archives, we work with the universities, we work with different memory institutions and public libraries, and they drive most of this development. And these kinds of conversations bring us to
what we're talking about today, which is metadata. So when you build software with empathy, you listen to the people who use your software, but you also watch how they're already using your software. So when we saw Ohio University run a staff project creating metadata for their dance poster collection, we recognized that it was not exactly the style of project we're used to seeing, and that we should pay attention. So when we stopped and thought back about previous projects, we realized, next slide, that the very first field-based project, the field-based transcription that Ben showed earlier, from the Alabama Department of Archives and History, where they indexed World War I service cards, might also be considered a metadata project, right? They created item level metadata for each card in their collection, and then they re-indexed the collection using that metadata. So instead of having to look for your great grandpa in a stack of virtual cards from a particular county, you can search for their name and hopefully find it. So what the dance posters and these index cards had in common, though, was that they were both single images per thing that needed metadata, right? Per form, in our sense. So one poster or one card could answer all of the fields or all of the questions that you wanted to ask about it. So what that meant is that our field-based transcription was good enough for item level metadata.
But only for items that had a single image.
Yeah. So, but what if you wanted to collect fields or answer questions about a 3-page letter or a 300-page book, right? Our model didn't work. And since Meredith, again, at Alabama, knew she had an upcoming project, the Civil War and Reconstruction Governors of Alabama, where she wanted to do just that, collect metadata about items like letters or petitions and things from the governor's office. It was at the top of her list when they pulled together another collaborative funding of state archives to fund some new features and From the Page in 2021. So these COSA members, so Alabama, Florida, Indiana, Maryland, Missouri, North Carolina, Texas, and Virginia, and many of their friends organizations or similar sort of organizations came together and helped fund 4 new features and From the Page. We're super excited about the fact that the friends organizations are there, because that means that this is not just an institution sort of pushing these projects onto their community and their volunteers, but their community coming and saying, no, we really want to do this type of work with you, and we're willing to help make it happen. So the 2021 kind of projects covered 4 new features: the spreadsheet transcription that Ben showed, a reviewer role feature, what we're talking about today, metadata creation, and then an upcoming quality control dashboard where we do some statistical sampling and kind of help point you to things that actually need to be reviewed. So this is the 3rd of those features. Metadata creation is a bit different from what we have historically done. So metadata applies to items rather than to pages. Okay, that was the first one we really realized. The users need to be able to see more than one page. They need to be able to kind of page through a document or a set of images that relate to a single item. You might do metadata creation with transcription, like we envision some transcription and then creating metadata for an item, but you might do it separate. Maybe you do a whole big transcription project and then you go back and you create metadata for it. Or you may do metadata all by itself. You might never get to transcription. There may be things that you can't even transcribe, but you still could create metadata for. And you all know this because many of you are librarians and archivists. So let's take a quick look. Ben's going to do a whole demo in just a moment, but here's what it looks like to the person creating the metadata. Looks a lot like our kind of standard field-based transcription. There's a couple of differences. So if you look on the far left here, you'll see icons in the image viewer that show the 4 pages of this letter, and you can click on each of those and the material on the right stays the same. It's static. So you can just page through a letter either through clicking on those icons or using the arrows. Our field-based looks about the same, but we've added the subjects field, which is what we call a multi-select field. So you could enter a number of different subjects that you believe are related to this collection, and people can choose from that. Here's how you would set it up, right? This is the project owner side. So it's relatively simple. You kind of set up lines, fields within lines. You give each of those fields a label, and we have a handful of different types: text, dates, multi-select.
Plain select.
Boolean, yes or no,
yeah,
I think. And then you can also add some instructions at the top that kind of show up in the form. So there's lots of ways to mix and match this feature with the other features and From the Page and get different kinds of projects from it. These all create metadata. So you could do transcription and then metadata, and followed immediately by metadata creation for the item. You could choose to do just metadata creation. You could run a full transcription project and then at a later point in time, add or make it a metadata creation project. You can do hybrid on who does what. So you could ask your crowd, your community, or the From the Page community to do transcription, and then you could make your project private, add staff members to it, and have the staff create the metadata using both the images and the transcriptions. You could ask your crowd to do transcription and then a set of metadata creation, maybe dates and locations, things that they can discern from doing the transcription, and then then make it private, add your staff, and add additional fields that you want just your staff to work on. We also think this has a lot of potential for metadata revision. And so we assume in our heads that staff would be doing that, but if you want to experiment with the crowd, that would totally work too. And we think translation of existing metadata can also be done through this interface. So lots of possible workflows, and I kind of wanted to present those because it's important for the next couple of slides that you understand what you might be doing with this. So let's see, let's talk about the inputs. So every project in FromThePage has to have images. That's kind of the center of our interface and what people see and how they interact with items. But those images can come in a lot of different ways. So you can have a zip file of images or zip files of directories of images for different documents. You can upload PDFs or zip files of PDFs, and we'll pull the images out of it. If you use Content DM, you can paste in a Content DM URL and we'll actually reference the images as they're hosted on Content DM. If you have any digital library system that supports IIIF, that's actually what we're using with Content DM as well. We'll pull in those images just if you hand us a IIIF manifest. Now, you can also choose to add text or metadata. You don't have to, but if you want to bring in text for the items in your project, we can pull in OCR from some systems. You can upload text files to go with pages. You have to name your text file to go with the page. We can pull the text layer out of a PDF. And if you run a transcription project on FromThePage, we can kind of hold those transcripts and make it part of your metadata project. If you want to do something like metadata revision, or you just want to show people the metadata you already have as part of a project, we'll pull in metadata from systems like Content DM or any IIIF system that publishes metadata in the IIIF manifest. But you can also upload metadata as a spreadsheet. And as long as you match it up to the work ID that we know about, and we help you figure that out by giving you a downloadable template, then we can use that as the metadata.
So what are the outputs? What do you get out of this? So currently what we support is being able to pull out a spreadsheet with a row per item and columns that tell you what the item came from and what metadata was contributed by the crowd or by your collaborators. So in the user interface, you say export work metadata, and then you get a spreadsheet that I've hidden a bunch of columns from, but the most important ones are you get the information that FromThePage knows about the item, which means a way of getting back to it in the user interface. So you get the title that you created, you get a URL to get back to it.
IDs from what Content DM.
Yes, and this is something that we're not showing. We also pull in any existing metadata and display that in this spreadsheet, including any identifiers that you uploaded or any IIIF manifests that were brought in. So these are all about either being able to get from the export back to the system on FromThePage to say correct or review things, or to be able to get back to the systems that you're using to correlate those crowd contributions. Then if you look at the bottom, the AK through AU columns, you'll see there's an additional set of columns that we append to the right side of this spreadsheet that gives you the status of the metadata. Has it been described? Who was it described by? Right, and that lets you know, what is in progress versus what is perhaps done. And all of that is followed by the actual fields that you put in yourself. So if you configured sender first name, sender last name, date, those are all filled in with the user created metadata. I should mention here, there's no screenshot for it, but we currently have a JSON-based API that is in draft state that will also be used for exposing this structured data with attachments to the originating items. And that is, if you'd like, contact me afterwards if you'd like to weigh in on the draft API. We also do the same kinds of things that we do with transcriptions in terms of quality control and attribution and review. So we track all the versions of a given piece of metadata. So you can see an example here that I did this morning where I was taking existing metadata. You see the recipient first name. Originally, I typed in pretty because that's what shows up on the letter. Pretty turns out to be a nickname for someone named Mitty. right? And so you can see that that was replaced, and then we added some more fields as well based on context or things we found later. Metadata works that are have metadata created can also be in review state. So you can mark them as needing review by either a limited number of people or by any collaborator who's working on this. And any reviewer can see this kind of data as well as correcting and approving the metadata itself.
So Ben's going to do a demo now. We're going to kind of walk through this live. You've seen the basic screenshots, which are always good if you're doing a live demo, but we're going to walk through creating one of these projects.
Okay, so we're going to start with a project that I just imported a lot of documents from the Portal to Texas History using their IIIF manifest. And that's great because we managed to pull in images and also their existing metadata. But none of these have been transcribed. This project really hasn't been configured at all. So the first thing we do is go into project settings and scroll down and enable metadata description. All right, so we want to be able to create descriptive metadata. Okay, that brings us into a new flow that lets us configure what metadata fields we care about. And the first thing that we're prompted to do is define what kind of task workflow we care about, right? Do we want people to transcribe text and then as well as creating metadata, or do we want people to only create metadata? So we're going to do a transcription creation combination project here. If we have time, we might go back and do a metadata only project. So I'm going to add instructions. I'm sure that real projects are going to have much more substantial instructions than that, right? Trying to explain possibly even on a field by field basis how to interpret the sources to create the appropriate structured metadata.
And to let your volunteers know that if they can't figure it out, what to do. That one, it's probably okay, and two, they can leave a comment on the page to like surface it as something that they'd like someone else to look at.
Okay, so we've got a handful of fields here, and we're going to add a new line. These are all text fields, but let's add recipient name, and we're just going to leave that as a plain thing because I'm going to save time. So letter date, I'm going to define as a date item. So that you see we have text, we have select, which is a drop-down list that users select a single thing from. We have text areas, which give people the ability to essentially enter a paragraph worth of information. Instructions gives you field-specific instructions for the people doing this work, and multi-select we'll get to in a minute. So letter date is going to be essentially a ISO style date, and you'll see that in a bit. Don't have to use it, but it definitely is an interesting option. So subject, we're going to make a multi-select, which allows people to add a pretty serious controlled vocabulary and select more than one item from it. So if I save this, I get to configure the subject, and we designed this flow so that hopefully you can paste in longer controlled vocabularies. So this is a set of World War I diaries, or World War I letters. So we know war. Good enough. Okay.
Shipping.
All right. So as I scroll down, once I save this again, you can see that I can preview the fields as they're going to appear to users as easily as possible. And I can do the same kind of things that we do elsewhere of, say, controlling the width of different fields and such things. You can see that drops down. So let's try it out. So I'm going to go into one of these letters. Let's find a nice 2-pager. This is on some fun World War I stationery. So this is
Wow.
giving Okay, so I'm going to stop right there because we don't want to transcribe the whole thing, even though it does seem kind of fascinating.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to save this, and let's take a look at the next page. And I'm going to just, skip a little bit and say,
Lovingly, Marguerite.
tell everybody, oh, for me. Lovingly, Marguerite. And I'll save that. And if this were a real project, this would be marked as incomplete and probably needing review. So ordinarily in a pure transcription project, going to the next page would take me to a page in a different letter that I would transcribe. But in this case, because this is a metadata creation project, the next thing that we're prompted to do is to fill out the metadata, right? And we have a lot of source material, as Sarah mentioned, that we want to pull from. So sender first name, well, that's on the second page. That's Marguerite. All right, sender last name, we don't know from context. Sent from, okay, we've got to go back to the first page to pull that up. And maybe we don't want to redecipher the handwriting, since this is also a transcription project. This is definitely true if you've gone through and transcribed everything already. So we can switch our view.
What's his name?
From
to. That's kind of fancy.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you.
From the images to the text, right? So I can go.
Oh, I'm sorry, I unmuted myself. Yeah, that's so fancy. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. So
And it like gets really bad. So they have to like put on the little boots.
Recipient name is Pretty. Did we get a date? Let's go back to the images.
Nope.
No, we don't have a date. All right. If we had a date, well, we know that it's 1918. So
How do we
a
know
date
that?
field, because it's World War I.
Because the other letters in this collection are also 19. You
Yeah,
typed it
okay.
wrong. Yeah.
Right, and here you see how the date type enforces an ISO standard date that is often used for databases. It sorts really well. It's not necessarily very user-friendly, right? So this might be more appropriate for staff fields than user-facing fields, but I think people do get the hang of it after a while. You can always use a text field instead for the date. And I'm actually just going to skip over this. And then the subjects, this seems like a lot of domestic life. And let's see, somebody came in a few miles ago, so I'm going to say that that's shipping as well.
It probably isn't, but that's
It probably isn't, okay. So I can say that that needs review if it does need to be reviewed. I can save it as incomplete metadata, or I can say I'm done with this. I know this is right. One of the things that I should mention is that in addition to having the page images and the text as source when I'm filling these things in, I also have the metadata that was imported into the project, right? So if you have catalog items that have been, that have metadata that was created 100 years ago, or that does not reflect the terminology you'd like to use nowadays, this is a chance to do revision and remediation of that metadata. It's also a chance to translate the metadata into other languages that serve your community a little bit more.
I actually think we should consider making which default view you see here something you can set in settings, because do you want to show them the images? Do you want to show them the transcript? Or do you want to show them the metadata? Is an interesting thing that I don't know the answer to. So I'm going to let project owners figure that out.
Yes. So we'll save that. Okay, so that is how a transcription and metadata creation project works. If I change the flow to just a metadata creation flow and save this, then the workflow is a little bit different. That page-by-page transcription step that we formerly had for transcription projects disappears, right? So we say, all right, well, this letter has completed metadata. This letter has no metadata. If I drop straight into it, then I get to see any existing metadata, and I can create metadata directly. So there's no transcription stage in this case. I still have the ability to view text, which would be especially appropriate if these were images that had OCR that was brought in, or other kinds of older transcripts, things like that. So I can still see the images, I can still see the metadata. So we'll just say this is in Orange, New Mexico.
Oh, so that's a date.
And a person, Mrs. Mitty Searle, right? And so let's go see if there's anything on the last page that might tell us who this is from. It's writing to you. Okay, I don't have any of that. You said there was a date though.
On the very, yep.
Oh, all right, September. So 1918, 09. You think that's a 13 or a 12? 12. All right, so we can save that. So these are the two different kinds of flows. Then when we want to get the data out, we can just go to export and export work metadata as CSV. I'm not actually going to demo the CSV here, but I can definitely attach it to anyone who's interested or send it on. So let me go back to our presentation.
Okay, so this is the sort of outcomes we're hoping to see from this feature. Like, can we start seeing more public terminologies in metadata? There's kind of differences in how different types of people describe items. Our favorite story here is actually from Ashley Yandel at North Carolina, did her thesis for her library degree on the types of words people used to search for pictures. And if you're looking for a cool picture of a vintage pig to put in your restaurant, the words you're going to use are going to be very different from the words that an archivist used to describe vintage, not vintage, we don't use that word, but agricultural, farming images. And so there's a disconnect, right? And so I'm curious to see if anyone chooses to use this, or if there's opportunities here for bringing more of those kind of public words into metadata. Every time we go to SAA or listen to a regional archives conference talk, people make jokes about their backlogs. So we are hoping this perhaps can help you get through some of that backlog of processing. I think it's a new model for public engagement. It'll be fun to see what the public does with this and how they interact with it. I think they will be uncomfortable, right? What we know about crowdsourcing volunteers is you have to get them over the hump. You have to reassure them that they are capable and they know what they're doing, and even if they make mistakes, there will be people who can review it or they can ask for help. So that's exciting to me. We also think this has potential to be new systems for staff work. One of the things that we saw during COVID is everyone went home, and people were looking for projects like Ohio University's Dance Poster Project that they could do meaningful staff work from home. And we also think that this has a lot of potential for more collaboration between the public and your professional staff. One of the things we always say is that you cannot replace professionals with the crowd, but we do think that you can complement professionals with the crowd. Yes. There's somebody in the waiting room. Yeah. So that's the kind of, we're wrapping up here, and we love just the idea of what are all the possibilities here. This is a quote that Bethany found when she was writing a blog post for us on metadata, but this idea that you can move away from a monolithic view and you can more represent the diversity of your public in your metadata. So to me, the questions are things like, can the crowd describe objects as well as documents? Could you do a vase, a statue, a photograph? What about folder level description? That to me is hard. I'm not an archivist. I don't think in folders, but I think it would be interesting to see about, can you do folder level description with this type of interface? Do you have volunteers who would do translations for you? I know Michael from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is on, and they have volunteers who do translation work or who do transcriptions in other languages. So that's an interesting question. And how does this make your material more accessible? Like both from a pure, accessibility, that we're all concerned with making sure that people who don't have their eyesight or who are getting older can still find material, but also can it just make it more findable? So that's kind of the end of our formal presentation, but we'd love to have a discussion, answer questions. There's a link at the bottom here and we'll drop it into the chat. If you want to do, if you want to kick the tires on this, you can do a 200-page trial from the page and you can set up your own project. We also wanted to mention that we have another webinar coming up next month.
Right, so we have another webinar next month that is telling Black stories with FromThePage. So there's a number of African-American archives or projects at non-African-American institutions that are primarily about African-American history. And we want to focus those for what is Black History Month in the US. So,
Lydia is actually on. She's going to be one of our speakers. She runs Virginia Untold. But we've got a neat set of projects that are going to come talk. So you don't have to listen to us talk. You can listen to people who use FromThePage talk about what they do. So.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to turn it over for questions. And Bethany, if you wouldn't mind moderating.
Yeah, there are already some really great questions in the chat. Earlier, Victoria asked about folksonomies and creating tags and wondered if that's possible through the metadata fields. So that might be one to start with.
We don't currently have the ability for users to create their own tags. That's a really interesting idea. I think we need to wait a little bit and see how this is used by archives, because there's a couple of different directions we could go with the development of the software, right? One would be to actually tie in to controlled vocabulary providers like Library of Congress subject headings or VIAF or things like that. So to kind of formalize this metadata creation even more. And the other direction would be what you're describing, which is turn it into more of a folksonomy. We don't know.
Well, and a lot of it depends on who's running projects and what are you comfortable with and what would you like to see too.
Yeah, I mean, definitely if we ever go in either of those directions, they will be configurable by the project owners.
And couldn't potentially there be like an open text field where you have users upload like comma separated tags that you could then transform potentially?
Yes. Yeah, that's actually, yes, you can do a folksonomy project. There you go, Victoria.
Yeah. And then Victoria also asked if you can import like crowdsourced transcriptions from another source when you were talking about the imports.
Yes, so we support, at least for projects that are uploading material, we support the ability to pull in anything that is a text file on an image by image basis, or anything that is a XML or HTML file on an image by image basis. We actually have a script that we wrote for the State Library of New South Wales to take the CSV outputs from a particular Zooniverse project and combine them together so that people could edit them. But the Zooniverse projects are so variable and so specific that we would need to modify that for any other project.
Right, that's the sort of question that if you want to know the answer, send us an email or hop on a call with us and we'll walk through your particular scenario.
Yeah. This is a good question here from Nick V. He asked, can a metadata schema be changed mid-project, and what happens to the already entered data if it does?
Okay, so we learned lessons from some of the limitations of our field-based transcription when we were building this. So it is very easy to augment any of the metadata fields to add new ones or to change their labels without losing anything. If you delete a field that you are collecting, and then you or someone else goes in and updates the metadata for that work, the deleted field will not appear. And when the user saves that, you'll lose that one cell of data. But everything else you can change labels or add fields and things like that. And we're actually thinking that there might be cases in which you have public-facing passes of metadata creation, and then you add a lot of things that are more, require more professional archival training for your actual catalogers to use and populate those additional fields.
And to do those as 2 separate passes by adding new fields. The one thing to add to that is if you delete a field, but something has already been, metadata has already been described and it's done, when you do an export, the old existing data will come out
in a separate column from your new one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that answers both Karen's question, and John Dugan also sent me another question about what happens to the original metadata. So I think that answers that. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask? You can unmute and chat if you would like.
Gina, I don't think I really understood your comment on the chat. Would you be willing to elaborate? I didn't really.
Needed additional metadata.
Oh, yes. Well, I was just kind of thinking in terms of staff projects where we just used a spreadsheet because we didn't have sufficient metadata about digitized images to publish online. Because like in my example was trademark records. All we had was trademark numbers. And no one can search for trademarks by a trademark number. They need an index, right? So we created an index first, but just in a spreadsheet, and we could have used this.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a great use case, I think.
So it's like that 2-pass model. So I'm sitting here scribbling notes, trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to write the procedure for that?
Great.
Nick asked a technical question about TSV rather than CSV. I'm a big fan of TSV, but it's not as friendly. I suspect from our previous conversations that you'll be using the JSON API. Does original metadata remain separate from the appended new metadata, or are they merged? Okay, this is something that we had to figure out. We had to discuss a lot. We decided to keep the user-created metadata separate from the original metadata. So there are cases in which we merge original metadata from different sources, like if you imported something via IIIF and then you upload a spreadsheet with different metadata values, we might overwrite those. But because this is, it does not necessarily, particularly for a project that's in progress, a public project that's in progress, it doesn't really reflect the institution's view of what the metadata about an item ought to be. They are kept totally separate. It is possible to take the metadata spreadsheet that we export and then re-import it into FromThePage as official metadata. But you would have to go through that step.
That metadata, even when you're just doing a transcription project, the metadata shows up in the About tab for a work. So it's there for transcribers to look at and to know about where it came from. It gives you a link back to, sometimes you can add you'll have a link back to the originating system and things like that.
John Dugan mentions some of the ideas on Flickr photograph projects, saying that for photograph projects, the public may know the more specific terms, and we might be the ones creating the folksonomy. That's a good example of the Indianapolis project.
Yeah, the Indianapolis Public Library I don't believe they've launched this project yet, but they have this collection of photographs of public parks in Indianapolis. And they'd really like to know which park each picture is of. And so yeah, I'm curious to see if they'll use this feature and kind of how they'll approach it, because do you let someone just type in the name of the park? Do you do a controlled vocabulary? Do you do both? Because you might get it wrong if you're, maybe there's an old park or a pocket park that no one talks about anymore, is not on the official list, right? There's a lot of.
And for photographic projects, I think one of the interesting things is that, for the Indianapolis case, they may run that as a field-based transcription, an image indexing project, right? Because they might just have the images, they're asking people to look at those. But a lot of photographs have something written on the back of them that's important for metadata purposes. And so for that, you actually need multiple images and you need to be able to describe this. So this might support, adding these things about who is on these photographs.
Right. John also asked about if there's value in separating name field components. Would you do first, middle, last as a separate thing? Would you do month, day, year as separate fields? And the short, the wimpy answer from us is do it however you want. I suspect that you would want last name as a separate field, because that seems to me what people would likely be searching on. But
I really don't know. Right.
Victoria has her, oh yeah.
Yeah, Victoria.
Thanks, Bethany.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk us through the links or the differences between the metadata functionality and the linking functionality that you've had baked into the transcription for so long.
Right. Currently, there's no connection between the middle, right?
Well,
Currently,
let's start with what
sorry,
does
yes.
Victoria is she talking about? If you are not familiar with our full text transcription
Right.
and our subject indexing that comes out of that.
Right. So what Victoria is referring to is the ability, when you're doing full text transcription, to tag the names of people or places or events that appear within the text. And that creates a entry for them or links them to an already existing entry within that collection. So you can see all of the pages that mention Jacob Graves, or all the pages that mention plowing and an agricultural diary that we run. Currently, there is no connection between these two. I think it would be kind of interesting if you had a transcription and metadata project to use some of those subject indexing fields, those results, right? Those subjects as a controlled vocabulary for some of these kinds of fields. That's something we haven't
Thought about.
hadn't occurred to until
But
you brought it up.
You can export all your subjects as a spreadsheet, and then you can use
you could.
the list and however you want, including you could copy and paste it into to your configuration for a project like this. Gina asks, user metadata is always at the work level, correct? Yes. If you want anything at the page level, you use field-based, or you do full transcripts or things like that. The places where we start running into problems is when you kind of have overlapping material. Like, we're still not great at, you've got a book that's got 3 pages of front matter, and then it has a bunch of ledger pages. So you want a spreadsheet for your ledger pages, but that's not going to apply to your the 3 front matter pages. I actually think this has the potential to solve some of that, because you could take your front matter style data and make it into metadata as a kind of a task, and then you'd have to jump through some hoops. I would mark them all as blank, and then you just drop people straight into transcribing the ledgers, and then they have to go back and look at the front matter when they get to the metadata field. That's kind of a hack, but it could get you there. The hybrid material we're not nearly as good at.
I think Colin has a question.
Oh, I was wondering about the connection of between these metadata fields and the section that's kind of tucked away under like works settings. There's an additional metadata section, and I think those export out into TEI. How do you imagine these two sections kind of working together in the future?
So we're again keeping the user created metadata separate from the staff created or imported metadata. So right now we have not figured out how to represent user created metadata as TEI XML, because each one of those spots where you go into a work and you say, well, here's the document creation data, or here are these other things, those all correspond to very specific TEI tags in the XML export. And anything that's project specific and user created is going to need to be a lot more almost unstructured, right? We can't say, oh, this goes in this TEI tag.
Well, okay, but let's take a step back. So one, I probably should have included those fields, which anyone who is a project owner or a staff member on the project can fill out, but no one who's the public can fill out. as a way to put metadata in, right? We have the spreadsheet import, you can pull it in from IIIF or Content DM. It turns out you can also type it in if you're a project owner. It's just the only people who do that are some of our documentary editing projects. If you type things in that field, check me on this.
Yes.
They show up when you hit that metadata, when you look at the about page for a work, or when you're in the description form and you're choosing that metadata drop down. It will show you anything that has been typed into those fields. So the way I look at it is we have all these different ways you can get metadata into from the page, and they all can complement each other. Like stuff can come in 3 different ways. You can pull it in from IIIF, you can upload a spreadsheet, and then you can type some stuff in, and it's all stuff we consider metadata, original metadata
in our terminology.
Yeah. That was a good question. I
Yeah.
didn't know anyone looked at those fields.
Any other questions or comments? Let me issue some thanks then. First off, thanks to our partners at COSA for both funding this feature and for working with us to define it and discuss it, and stakeholder meetings and to review it and test it. They have been absolutely amazing. And then thanks Bethany for moderating, and thank you all for attending.
Yeah.